Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colin Day. I'm a financial advisor with Correct Capital Wealth Management. Hopefully, you're doing well wherever in this crazy world of ours you might be finding yourself today. Today, you are joining us for our quarterly financial wellness webinar. Intentionally try to schedule this somewhere near maybe a break if you're on the West Coast or during lunch if you're on the East or in the Central time zones to make sure that you can plop down in front of your monitor for about 15, 20 minutes and hopefully you feel a little bit entertained by myself in regards to the topic of the day. And today, you are here for how much do you need to retire? And if you can believe it, this particular webinar is, let me do some math really quick, 16 years in the making, and I'll explain why in a second. But as it comes to knowing how much you need to retire, it's a pretty common refrain and question that I get from folks in terms of trying to understand, are they on the right path? Because even if we can figure out, like, I think you need this amount of money to be able to retire, the reality is it's one thing to know maybe where you're headed, but it's a completely different thing to figure out is what my current plan is going to get me there, right? The challenge is, and something that we're going to talk about as it comes to figuring out how much one might need, knowing the number is not always easy to figure out, but it's also a big challenge for a lot of folks to kind of understand, okay, what does this number actually represent to me and how modifiable is it over time? Because if you're sitting on the other end of your computer screen right now, and let's say you have 5 years out from retirement, well, think about where you were 5 years ago. So that'd be the year 2019. You know, there's a pretty crazy thing, unfortunately, that's going to happen to this world just 1 year later in 2020 and even 2021 and beyond. And if we think about our 5 year increments, if you're even farther away from that, think about how different the world was even 10 years ago or 15 or 20. Again, depending on how far you have to go or perceive to go between now and retirement, this could result in some very different answers and responses in regards to how much you think you might need for retirement. So with that as a precursor to what we're going to discuss today, just a quick disclosure here. As you probably are well aware, we're financial advisors, but in a group setting like this, we're providing education for you all. This isn't tax, legal, or investment advice. I am going to show you a planning software that we do use with some folks when appropriate called Right Capital. I'm going to show that to you in the second half of the presentation. We are not sponsored by them. We are not affiliated with that organization. And again, all the information that's going to be shared there is education in nature as well. Now, I promised you all that this particular presentation was 16 years in the making, and here's why. Back in the year 2008, again, think about where we were back in 2008. We are just in the beginning of the Great Recession. The market's already down like 15%. And I very distinctly remember this. This is even before I entered the financial services industry. I remember this particular commercial from a company that technically no longer exists in the US. They go by a different name now. It's a company called ING. And don't worry, you don't need to adjust your TV sets, so to speak. There's no audio in this video, and it's just going to play in a loop for a couple of minutes until I say stop. Now, this particular presentation, or this commercial, excuse me, is from ING, now known as Voya. So if you're familiar with Voya, they're a pretty big player in the 401k space. And the intention behind this particular commercial is how this person who's just walking along in their neighborhood is carrying around a big orange number under their arm. And in this variation of the commercial, this guy is talking to his neighbor who has no idea why he's carrying this number. And the person who's cutting the hedges has absolutely no idea how much money he needs to save for retirement. So the walker with the dog, he knows that he needs about $1 million to be able to save for retirement, whereas the hedge clipping gentleman has no idea and just thinks that $1 gazillion might be appropriate for him and what he is searching for. Now, the challenge with a commercial like this is that, of course, the intention is I don't know what my number is. I need to go talk to Voya. I need to go talk to, or ING in this case. I need to talk to this representative, and they're going to tell me what my number is and what I should be shooting towards. In other variations of this commercial, there's people like riding bikes downtown, people walking from businesses, trying to get into doorways and being stuck because their number is so big and trying to hold it up. So the problem with this kind of commercial is that they're trying to make it seem very easy to really understand what you need to be able to retire. But the reality is that if you've ever done an exercise like this before, having a number underneath your arm right now is a data point that can help you. It could be kind of a North Star, but you change one variable. You change the year that you want to retire, when you think you might elect for Social Security, an early disability situation for either you or maybe your spouse or maybe the kids that want to go to a more expensive school. That changes the number, right? That $1 million that gentleman is carrying right there could be, by the time that he actually gets to retirement, needs to be 1.5 or $2 million. Could be less, but most times, let's say 9 out of 10 times, it's probably going to be higher than the estimate. So the challenge here is that a commercial like this is trying to make it simple, right? They're just trying to say, hey, you need a number, go see ING. When the reality is that there's a much deeper conversation that should be had here. Here's how we spell out, why we don't like this particular number approach. So the big thing here is that, number one, you're anchoring your retirement to reach a number. Okay, so we need to attain a number to be able to retire. So think about that for a second. And maybe you've done this exercise before. Let's say you need $2 million to be able to retire, just as an example. So everything that you do is now dependent on reaching that number. You're changing how much you save. You're changing how you invest. You might be changing your investment philosophy or your risk tolerance to meet those particular goals. And I don't necessarily like that idea because there's so many other variables that we could play with besides just the savings goal and when you want to retire and then what your needs are in the future. And there's going to be several variations of that between now and when the person wants to retire. Now, this, for many people, is going to prevent you from retiring because I can't retire until I have my number. And for many people that are in a situation like this, that number might not actually be grounded in any form of reality. So, for example, a very common thing that I hear is, hey, Colin, my neighbor, because they live on my street and probably have an income level that's similar to mine, they retired and they said that they had $1 million once they retired in their 401k. Well, I don't know if that's the same amount that you need. You might need more, you might need less, but you might not have ever done an exercise to figure out that number. You just heard from somebody else that's what they had. I used to work a lot in the government sector, work with a lot of police officers and a lot of firehouses. And when there's downtime in a firehouse, a very common conversation is about your personal finances, more specifically about how your investments are doing. But as you can imagine, some people are saying, hey, I'm going to work for so many years, I'm going to get a pension, and then in my retirement plan through work, I need to have this amount because that's what Captain had when he retired last year. Or when I got sat down by the lieutenant and they told me to enroll for my retirement plan, they said that if you do this, you'll achieve this number. So that's the number that I want to have. There's a person I used to work with several years ago who told me, by the time I retire, I want $1 million in this account. Well, that person's, 23, 24 years old. Like, what's $1 million really going to look like in 30 years when they want to, finally hang up the boots, so to speak? So this number that people like to think about might not actually be grounded in any form of reality. Finally, the number is going to inevitably change because life happens. Market volatility, hearing other kinds of retirement stories. One neighbor on one side of you says you need $500,000 to retire. The other side of you says $1.5 million. Well, are you going to be the average? You're going to just shoot for $1 million? Do you need either of those numbers? Do you need more? So when it comes to all the various kinds of stories that we hear as we get closer and closer to retirement and we start to, gather fear in return in terms of how we're going to approach our retirement, this is why we don't like the number approach. There's too many things that can happen here. So then you're probably wondering, well, Colin, if I don't like that, what should I be doing instead? Well, the process that financial advisors like myself and others like to bring people through is a financial plan. Getting a financial plan, whether it's just by interacting with somebody, going onto your 401k website, being able to play with multiple variables on where we think we're headed in the future, that's going to lead to a more fruitful experience than just having a number and shooting towards it without actually knowing if that's going to be the right kind of number for you. So we're going to use an avatar couple. And if you've attended one of these webinars before, here are recurring guests, Joe and Jane. So Joe and Jane are both 54 years old. They are recently empty nesters. Their kids are out of the house. They are an engineer and teacher, respectively. Joe, through his engineering firm he works for, has a 401k plan. That's where majority of his retirement investing is going. Jane, on the other hand, working as a teacher, she's relying on a pension plan to be able to retire on time. Now, the other things that they are thinking about. So, most people aren't, waking up in the middle of the night saying, "Oh my gosh, I really need to know my number. I really need to figure out what is the number." They're trying to figure out a whole bunch of stuff. The actual reality of their situation is that they're just trying to figure out, okay, when can we retire, knowing that we might not retire at the same time? When should Joe take Social Security? We're going to talk a lot about that. And then third, how will retiring early affect Jane's pension? Because as you can imagine, if you work for a particular organization for a long period of time, the pension tends to be bigger. But if you decide to retire early and rely on Joe to foot the bill for a while, still getting a paycheck, well, that could impact the long-term likelihood that you don't run out of money because that pension's dictated on a shorter period of time. So these are the types of questions that around the dinner table now that it's just the two of them, they're having these types of discussions and trying to figure out what should we actually be doing? Should I know a number, or maybe can we place with some variables that fit our situation so that we're comfortable heading in a particular trajectory? So we are going to jump over to a financial planning software, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a second so I can do a new share. So we have Joe Sample and Jane Sample. Again, they're both 54 years old. Their approximate total net worth right now is $1 million. So I've already punched in a little bit of this information. Let's say that they provided me a data sheet, or they came to me and said, we can punch in some information for your account so you don't have to do all that legwork. I appreciate that. In their checking account, they generally have about $10,000. In their savings account, about 20. They've got some joint credit card debt from when they were moving one of their kids to their their new home now that they've graduated from college. So they've got $5,000 in recurring credit card debt right now. On the investment front, like I said before, Joe is relying on his 401k plan to be able to foot the bill for retirement. So he's got about $700,000 in his 401k right now. So not chump change. He's doing pretty well there. Joe and Jane also, in the past couple of years, have started to fund a Roth account because they realized, well, Jane only has her pension. So we should probably find another account for her to defer to so that she's not so reliant on just the monthly checks. And so that's what the $10,000 each in their Roth accounts is all about. Now, they do own a home, and they think that that home, if they were to sell it, is $500,000, but they don't want to sell the home to be able to pay for their retirement. So we're not including their home in the plan, but it does come into play with their net worth, as does their mortgage. So overall, so if we add up all the positive numbers, we subtract the ones in parentheses, we come up with a net worth of about $1 million. Okay, so that's where they stand right now at 54 years old. For them, as we kind of go through a planning process, we start to identify more of the questions and concerns they have. So, for example, Joe wishes to retire at age 65, while Jane, who's a stressed out teacher, I'm married to one, I get it, she wants to retire at 60. So she might actually retire 5 years earlier than Joe, which from a stress perspective, well, of course it eases her burden, but now Joe is the breadwinner. And now we have a pension check coming in for Jane, which probably isn't going to be the same amount that they were earning before. So can we maintain like savings habits? What about the risk tolerance in their accounts? Things like that. Now they're estimating that the retirement expenses, not including any outstanding mortgage payments that they might have once they get to retirement, to be about $7,000. Because they're not going to be on their workplace health insurance, we always like to show what Medicare costs could look like. And so for both of them, assuming that Jane stays on Joe's insurance for the 5 years that she's just making her pension check, we're estimating those expenses to be about $6,000 a year. And you might think, wow, that's a big expense. And I would agree with you. It is. The reality of the situation is that we have Medicare premiums, we have to go to the doctor, we've got co-pays and deductibles and prescriptions to fill and all those kinds of fun things. So the national average number that we see here is not for Joe and Jane specifically, but rather just a national average number. And then finally, at the end of life, if we need a long-term care, LTC, we're in a situation where we need assisted living or we want in-home care, things like that. They're already putting in, again, a national number. Which is pretty big. And so they're assuming that this couple is going to live to 90, and at 89 and 90 years old, they're going to have these long-term care costs. Currently, their income looks like this. We've got Joe's engineering salary at 110. We've got Jane's teacher salary at 70. Now, Joe has been paying into Social Security his entire working career. And so we just use an estimated amount. Joe didn't have a Social Security statement. No big deal, Joe. We'll just use what we think is a normal number based on your current wages. However, Jane does not pay into Social Security. So for example, my wife, works in the state of Missouri. She takes part in the state teacher's pension plan. This particular plan is exempted from Social Security withholding. So we don't have to worry about her withholding into Social Security, but that means she's probably not going to get a Social Security check. Okay. So for them, we're really anticipating Joe's Social Security and nothing for Jane. Going forward, we have Jane's pension down here. Based on that age 60 retirement would be somewhere in the ballpark of $42,000. Right now, their savings, Joe is now maxing out because the kids are finally out of the house. Hopefully that stays that way and they don't boomerang back in. So right now, Joe feels confident that he can max out for the rest of his working career. And Joe and Jane, again, are starting to fund a Roth IRA on a regular basis. And they're contributing about $100 a month, which results in about $1,200 over the course of the year. Last thing, in retirement, they think that their expenses might increase, they might decrease. Right now, we're just imagining right now that their living expenses are about $6,500. But as I said before, once they get to retirement, they think their expenses, again, not including any kind of mortgage or home expenses, is about $7,000. So when we put all this information together, we have the basic stuff, which again was on this net worth screen, talking about all their investable assets, but we have all these other goals and all these other considerations that we have to put into account. What do we have? What don't we have? Do we have Social Security or do we not? Do we have a pension? Is it low? Is it high? So when we run all the scenarios, we do what's called a Monte Carlo analysis. And in the Monte Carlo analysis, what we're trying to figure out is what's the probability that they don't run out of money? What you're going to see here is that the probability of success is 55%. So if they were to retire based on the plans and the numbers and everything that we just shared, half the time and half of the lifetimes that they can project out 1,000 times, they do not run out of money. However, 45% of the time they do, which means that they're either going to be moving in with the kids or they're basically going to be destitute and maybe on Medicaid when they retire, or worse, they're going to have to sell that house, which is something that they don't want to do. So we might come to the reality of saying, hey, it's not a number, again, that we're trying to reach here. We're just trying to illustrate the point that based on where we're headed, we don't have enough. And sure, again, they could save more money and then they can reach some kind of arbitrary figure, but maybe they want to get a little bit more creative about how they want to handle things. So if they're in a situation right now where they're thinking, okay, I've got all these variables down here that I have in play. Let's start to think about more intelligently how we want to think about why we're starting to approach retirement the way that we are. So for example, Jane might say, okay, I think it's a little bit unfair that I retire 5 years earlier. I can suck it up. Worst case scenario, maybe I go to a different school in the district. Maybe I change exactly what I'm teaching, perhaps, because I know someone's going to retire around this time. Maybe I'll have an opportunity to work a little bit longer. So let's say Jane says, I can, as an affirmation of love, Joe, I'm going to stick it out for 2 more years for us. Then the other thing that we have to consider here is the fact that the pension's going to increase. And let's assume that that goes up about $4,000 because she's there for 2 more years. So she gets a little bit more pension income out of all this. So based on this conversation that Jane's willing to work a little bit later, we can see that, again, the original plan was 55%, but now just by making those changes, well, plan has actually improved 10%. And you might be saying, Colin, it's only 10%. I'll say this, they're in their mid 50s and they're trying to project their plan higher to get a better probability of success. Moving 10% is pretty dang good. Okay. But we obviously have some work to do because this couple, they're not D students. They want to be at least B students when we do this exercise. So we might also find out later, hey, we did a budget exercise and figured out this isn't actually the amount of money that we think we spend. And our retirement expenses, we actually think are going to be about $6,000. And what we're spending right now is about $55,000. And by doing that, if again, we hit the refresh button, what we're going to see, of course, is that the probability of success shoots up again. Because now my ongoing expenses have gone down, not only for the next 11 or so years that they're still working, but also all throughout retirement. So now we've shot up really dramatically, 79%. But let's not stop there. Maybe what we find are a couple other interesting tidbits. So for example, if I click on Social Security here, I'm going to see here that, again, we're just considering Joe in this equation. There is what they call the current strategy, but then also a more optimal strategy. The more optimal strategy has Joe waiting to collect Social Security, not at full retirement age, which for him is 67, but rather waiting until age 70. By waiting longer to collect Social Security, we get a bigger check. Thus, the lifetime amount that we receive is almost $200,000 more. So after showing Joe and Jane this, they realize, oh, shoot, We've got a low-hanging fruit option here. Yeah, I've got to spend down my retirement assets because of the fact that I'm not going to have recurring wages from the government, but Jane still has her pension check coming in, and I've still got my 401k and my Roth IRAs to dip into as necessary. I can wait 3 more years, and then I'll turn on Social Security, and that'll be a much bigger amount for the family. Another thing that we might notice is that they're in a situation right now where their current asset allocation on their investments is, by my perception, pretty conservative. They only have about 50% of their money in the stock market. That's that 51% you're seeing on the screen on the left. Whereas we might suggest, hey, if we have about a decade to go before we get to retirement, I'm still supportive of people participating more in the stock market. We can be a little bit more aggressive, knowing that we can always pull back later as necessary. So we might be suggesting to them that their target allocation should be closer to 70% in the stock market. So again, if we go back and we think about this a little bit and we decide to model something else, let's say that we change that allocation to something more appropriate and we change the Social Security to a more optimal strategy. Hit the refresh button again. Cool. Now we're up to 80%. We're really rolling. Maybe they do a little bit more budget exercises and realize, oh yeah, now we don't have to pay for our kids' health insurance anymore, and we're saving a lot more money. Now we can triple the amount of money we're respectively putting into our Roth IRAs. And we can continue to iterate on this. But let's say that this is the stopping point for Joe and Jane. We get to 83%. You might say, Colin, 83% is pretty good, but I actually consider myself an A student. I'm not a B minus student. Why would you say 83% is a good stopping point? The reality is that, again, we still have a decade to go, right? There's going to be more variability that we need to throw into this. Again, we can't just use a number to try to solve for what we think the retirement equation is. We have too many variables to consider here. The 83% is a pretty good number. And the other way that I like to think about this is that we're not focusing on the 83% of successes. We're actually just focusing on the 17% of failures. To put it a different way, 4 out of 5 times, Joe and Jane live in retirement and have absolutely no problems with the amount of money that they have in their accounts. They live their lives, they have their expenses, they do the things they want to do, and they're able to meet the bills that they have coming to them. Only 1 out of 5 situations do we maybe have to think a little before we do something. So for example, if we modeled in like buying a car every 10 years or so, something like that. Well, hey, if we have a big expense coming up, but because this is a computer program, it's just going to think, hey, it's 10 years, and now we have to program another car payment into this. Well, if it's a bad year in the stock market and you need money for a down payment, what are we going to do? We're going to go buy the car now, or perhaps are we going to wait for the market to recuperate a little bit? We'll probably wait a year, maybe 2, depending on the market situation. We'll just do the maintenance on the car for another couple of years. It's not a huge deal. Hopefully we catch a good break in the market rebounds. Okay, now I can spend that. This program's not that smart. It doesn't understand that we have levers that we can push and pull, that we might have more patience with our plan over time. So with something like this, an 83% I actually think is pretty good. One last way of thinking about this is that I want you to live the retirement that you want, which forces us to spend money. Because if you have 100% on that probability of success, that's great. You won't spend through all your money. That's great. However, if you're on your deathbed and you're wondering about all the things that you wish that you would have done with the times when your knees were still working, that you and your kids were still around, we want you to forecast expenses in there. We want this to be a stress test. So for many folks, we factor in additional vacations. We factor in paying for weddings. We factor in all these different things to make sure that they're active participants in their retirement and not just sitting on the couch watching Maury, so to speak. Okay? So with that being said, Joe and Jane are off on a pretty good trajectory right now. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring us back to the presentation real quick. And so now we can see Joe and Jane are doing a lot better. They can finally, when they have that dinner, they can celebrate. They feel much more confident. They are not worried about some kind of arbitrary figure that they have to hit in their account. It's mostly just put on the blinders, do these things, and now you can refocus. Now you can concentrate on the things that are going to be most important to you now while you're still working, knowing that there's going to be things that change between now and retirement, and then even into retirement. So with that being said, that's my prepared comments for you all. I wanted to leave a couple minutes at the end of this just to see if there was any questions for the group. However, if you have personal questions about what we talked about today, or if this has enlightened you in some way where you say, maybe I need to figure out a little bit more about my upcoming retirement, or maybe I just need to restructure how I'm thinking about my 401k because this has got me thinking, am I contributing enough? Am I putting money into the right kinds of investments? Those types of things. Myself, John, Alexia, we're all here for you to ask those questions and to hopefully provide you with some direct answers. Because in a group setting like this can be a little bit intimidating, of course, if you have a question. But if you want to talk to us one-on-one or schedule time, I would encourage you to do so. So I will leave a couple minutes at the end here. If there's any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. We're not that large of a group where I don't think anybody's going to be stumbling over each other. If it's easier for you to just type the questions into the chat, you can do so. So I'm going to stop for a second. And if anybody has any comments, I'm here for you.
Thank you, Colin.
If we wanted to set up some time with you to go through an exercise like this, is email the best way to set that up?
Yes. Yeah, shoot me an email and then I will send you my scheduling link and we'll find some time to chat.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thanks. Any other questions for the good of the group? Thanks, Ken. A recording of this will also be made. So just in case, you came in late, or if you have any additional questions or you want to replay something that we talked about, you can feel free to just get that recording. I will post it on LinkedIn, and then however you received this email for the webinar, you'll receive the recording link through that person as well. All right, any other questions? Okay. We will leave it there. Again, if you've got personal questions or things that you want to discuss, and if it's applicable, you want to bring somebody else into this meeting, a loved one, spouse, whatever that might be, perfectly fine to do it. Because ultimately, you're not on an island when you consider your retirement. It's probably you and a partner, perhaps. And if that's the case, we definitely want to make sure that both parties are on the same side, which may necessitate a conversation with everybody together. You're welcome, Luna. You're welcome, Laurie. Thank you. Okay. If anybody else has questions, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Thanks, everybody.
The opinions expressed in this program are for general informational purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual or on any specific security. It is only intended to provide education about the financial industry. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult your financial advisor prior to investing. As always, please remember, investing involves risk and possible loss of principal capital. Please seek advice from a licensed professional. Correct Capital Wealth Management is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Correct Capital Wealth Management and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. No advice may be rendered by Correct Capital Wealth Management unless a client service agreement is in place.